What's up everybody? Thank you for joining me for another tutorial here at Blended Graphics. Today's photo manipulation that we're going to create is this man basically emerging from this town, this oversized man, and he's going to be looking up at the moon, which is going to have a face on it as well. It's going to be a fun Photoshop tutorial that I think you're really going to enjoy. Now the video is a bit on the longer side, so I hope you stick around for the entire video. There's a lot to take away from this tutorial. You're going to learn about how we can create landscapes from scratch, how you can blend your subjects with their background, and essentially learn a lot more about highlights and shadows and how we can use different textures on top of skin textures as well to create something completely unordinary. It's going to be a lot of fun and I think you're going to enjoy it. Like I said, I'm not going to keep talking about this, so let's just jump right to the video. Alright, so here's our fresh canvas. It's 5,000 by 4,000 pixels. And the first thing that we're going to do is start creating our environment. So we're using this picture here and it's going to be our foreground. And I'm using the pen tool to create a selection of just this bottom half of the picture. Once we've connected all the dots, what you want to do is right click and then click on make selection. Once you do that, you hit OK. And then you want to add a layer mask. And what that'll do with the layer mask, it'll just create a selection of only the part that you selected. And I'm just going to clean some of this part up here. I don't want this top half, so we're going to fill that in again with black on that layer mask. Then you can hit Control or Command T, and we're going to just resize this a little bit and put this at the bottom of our canvas. Great, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this layer off, and then I'm going to bring in our main subject. And what I want to do is hit the Quick Selection tool, and then at the very top, we want to hit Select Subject, and then that's going to do a great job of creating selection of our subject. We'll hit the layer mask. We can turn on our other layer back on, and then for our subject, let's hit Command T, and then we're just going to bring him down a little bit so we can have him sunken down more into where our town is going to be. So somewhere right about here looks good. And now we can start working on our midground. So we're going to turn off those other layers, and I just want this building on the left side. We're going to repeat that process of using the pen tool to create a selection of just this building here. And then we'll add that layer mask so we have that by itself. Let's turn back on our other layers, and then we're going to use the transform tool by pressing Command T, and let's just bring this off to the left side, scale it up a little bit, and we're going to place it just right about here. Okay, perfect. Let's add in our next photo. So let's turn these off real quick, and this is going to be more of our landscape here. And for right now, I just want to create a selection of the bottom part here because what we're going to do is just replace the sky. So once we've created a selection of this, add the layer mask. We need to go back in to get the sky that's right where that bridge is. And to do that, we're going to go up to select, down to color range, and we're going to sample that sky color and hit OK. And then on the layer mask using a black brush, we just want to fill that in with black. So just using a nice soft round brush, doesn't matter, 100% opacity. Let's paint on that layer mask to get rid of that sky. We're going to paint back in those cables on the bridge later on, so don't worry about that. And with these layers turned back on, let's just resize this and put this right where we want it at, somewhere that looks good for us. Okay, so we are going to have that moon in the top left corner here. So what I want to do is just kind of push everything down a little bit. So we're starting with that left building, and then the background, we'll just bring that down a bit because I want to leave some space up top. Like I said, we are going to put the moon there, and I don't want to have too much interaction with our background. Alright, so here's our sky that we're loading in. We are ultimately going to change this. This is just kind of a placeholder for right now, so we're just going to put this in place here. So somewhere right about here. And at this point, I'm realizing that our foreground looks a bit too small and not realistic enough, so I'm going to increase the size of this. So let's scale this up somewhere like so. And then once we've added that in, we're going to start adding in another element just to give it a bit more personality. So we have this nice cat that we're just going to add on the building at the bottom left corner here. Like I said, just to give it a bit more personality. And for this layer here, you want to Alt or Option click on the eyeball to turn everything off. We're going to use this house on the right side of where our subject is. And once we've added that layer mask and created that selection, you want to Alt or Option click on that eyeball once more to bring back those layers. And like I said, we're just going to put this on the right side of our main subject. So let's see here. Somewhere right about there. Let's line that up. And we can even rotate this slightly. I only want the right half of this, so on the layer mask, we're just going to paint black on the left half of that, because we don't want that anymore. Alright, so that looks really good, and let's go ahead and continue on. We're going to start building up the background even more. So I've got these nice houses that we're going to use. So let's turn that on, and we're just going to create a selection of just those houses. And keeping in mind of our perspective, we only want the tops of the houses to be seen. You know, we're trying to make this as realistic as possible. So somewhere right about here, I think is going to be right where we want it. All right, perfect. Now we can go ahead and load in some trees that I got from Envato Elements. Just some 3D assets. We're just going to fill in some of the space here and just build up our scene a little bit more. This one we're going to put in our foreground, just at the bottom right here. And once we've loaded in our trees and we've got this taken care of, we're going to load in our moon. And just like our main subject, we're going to do the select subject feature to isolate that. And this is going to be on that top left corner, like I said. And what I'm trying to aiming for here is the darker spots of the moon in that texture I want to use for the face that we're ultimately going to put on there. So somewhere right about here, and I'm aligning that with where his eyes are looking at. So I think that looks really good. So what we can go ahead and do now is just work on our sky a little bit. So we're going to erase this one that we had, and we're going to load in just some stars in a starry night. We're just going to scale this up to fit our canvas. And then once we have this in place, what we want to add on top of this is a levels adjustment layer, because we want to create a bit more contrast. So let's go ahead and bring in that shadow anchor point and then the highlights as well, and that's going to give us kind of that contrast that we're looking for. And then after the levels adjustment layer, we're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top of this and just desaturate it a little bit so it's not so heavily involved with the blue tones. And I'm just going to adjust the levels just a little bit more. Perfect. All right, so now let's load in our new sky image that I ultimately decided to go with instead of our previous one. And we're just going to scale this up, and you can kind of see where those clouds are. That's going to be our transition point into that starry background that we just put in there. So using a soft round brush, after we've added a layer mask on this, I'm just going to paint black on that top left corner. And just using a soft round brush, I'm not using any other textured kind of brush. And this is just going to help us blend in with that starry background layer that we had before. All right, so something like this will be just fine for us, because we want to have that top left corner dark so our moon can glow. And then this next image is going to be our sunset that we're going to put at the bottom here. And I just want the bottom half of this, so we're going to erase the top part, painting black on a layer mask to blend that in with our other sky images. So sometimes working with clouds and skies can be a little bit tricky, trying to get everything matched together. So what we're doing here is just tweaking as much of this as possible to make the blending process look very seamless. I'm going to add in that same sky background that we just had, and we're going to continue to add a little bit more of these textures on the left side. So I'm going to put it in place here. We're going to right click and use warp. And I just want to kind of configure and warp these clouds a little bit so it has a bit more of a curvilinear shape. All right, this looks good. Let's add a layer mask and then paint black on the areas that we don't want. And now the game that we're playing right now is essentially just going between those different layers, either painting white or black on those layer masks to really tidy things up and clean it, just to make that blending process look really seamless, and just trying to get it to essentially the look that you're aiming for. All right, so I'm just going to take a few more seconds, just going back and forth between these different layers and just cleaning this up a little bit to something that is what I'm looking for. And when you're doing this with your personal projects, make sure that you take your time with it. I can be a bit of a perfectionist sometimes, so I may spend a little bit more time than others just trying to really perfect it to what I like. All right, so we're going to add a new layer here, and we're going to paint a dark bluish tone right at where those clouds are transitioning to the nighttime scene. And we're just going to paint that in a little bit, very, very faint color. And this is going to give us kind of the effect that those clouds are slowly dissipating into that starry night background. And this is just going to help with our transition a bit more. Another thing that's going to help us out with our transition is adding another cloud image beneath all of these. We're going to rotate this so that way the clouds line up. And then what we want to do is add a levels adjustment on top of this to darken that cloud up a bit. So let's bring in those shadows, and then we can go ahead and turn this off, and then we can add our layer mask on there. So using a soft round brush, let's just erase this top left portion. But for the clouds, I'm going to switch up our brush to more of a cloud brush texture. Because like I said, we want to keep the textures the same. So we're scaling this up and then painting black right around the edges here. And that's going to keep the cloud texture that we want. All right, we're going to go ahead and continue building up that sky. We're going to enhance our sunset a little bit. So on a new layer, on top of all of that, we're going to sample that yellow there, change it up a bit. And then let's just go ahead and softly paint some of that light back in to give us a little bit of that glow, and then just help make it a little bit brighter. And then if you press E, we can use our eraser to just remove some of that top portion there just a little bit. And with that completed, let's work on those houses a little bit. So let's get into that group. Let's add a levels adjustment on top of those houses. And we're going to clip it onto that. And then let's just darken it up just a little bit here. And then on top of this, we're going to use that same yellow on a blank layer on top. We're going to clip it to the houses and then just paint a little bit of a haze just on top to give it that atmospheric depth. All right, that's looking really nice. We're going to go back into our sky once more, and we're going to enhance the sunset. So let's add a solid color adjustment layer at the top, and we're going to use that same color. Let's put this into an overlay blend mode. I think is going to look really good for this. And let's invert that mask by pressing Command I. And then just at the bottom left here, let's just paint that back in, and just going to make it pop just a little bit more. All right, so at this point, it's just now about starting to work with the lighting levels for the rest of our image here. So we're starting back with the trees, and that left tree to be more exact. We're going to add an exposure adjustment layer and clip it onto that tree. Let's lower that down a bit. So somewhere right around here. And then once we have that in place, on a new layer underneath our tree, we're going to use that same yellow tone that we did for the sun, and we're just going to brighten this up a little bit to kind of give that impression that we have some light reflecting off the back side of that tree. And then as we zoom in here a little bit, we can just clean some of this up a little bit so it's not so pronounced. All right, so I think that looks really good there. And then we can even change our color a little bit on the tree. So let's add a color balance adjustment layer on top of the exposure adjustment layer. And we're just going to shift these anchors to more of those warmer tones, just to help match the sunset tones as well. And then we can lower the opacity on that just a little bit there. So that's looking really nice. Let's transition to the rest of that background. We're going to add a levels adjustment layer on top of this. Let's increase those shadows a little bit, but we're going to take out those highlights pretty much for a lot of this here. And then instead of inverting the mask, we're just going to paint black on the layer mask instead, just on the edges there, right where we're going to have the light kind of peeking through the tops or the sides of the building and have that light interaction with our sunset. And we can even turn off our main subject here so we can get a better idea of what our background looks like. Touch up some of these areas here. Now, where that bridge is, I want to do a little bit more adjustment with the bricks there because I don't really like the lighting. So I'm going to add a new brick texture that we're going to use here. And the first thing that we want to do is match the tones on these two bricks. So we're going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and just on the hue anchor there, we're just going to slide this over a little bit to make it a bit more orange to match the bricks on our original image. And I think this looks really good. There's the before and after, looks great. Let's combine these two together by pressing Command E. And then we're going to turn this into a smart object so that way we can do some more editing with this. Let's lower the opacity and move this to the left. And if you either Control or Command click on these end anchor points here, what we can do is just distort this so that way we can match the perspective of that original wall. So I'm going to take a couple more seconds to do this. It looks like we're getting pretty close here. And then we can go ahead and hit that checkpoint at the top. Let's turn up the opacity once more. And then we're going to add a layer mask on this, and on the edge, let's just slowly fade away this edge to the background so it's not a very harsh line that we have here, and it helps blend our images together a bit more. And you can see the bottom is not quite down far enough, so we're just going to stretch this down a bit so that way it goes past our building. And then we can erase the left side. In fact, we're going to cheat a little bit. We're going to add some trees that we're just going to put over that. So that way we don't have to worry about that funny looking edge on the left side of our bricks there. So let's bring in our first tree here. And then we're just going to, there we go. Let's go ahead and bring this down a little bit. And we want to make sure obviously it's on top of our bricks. There we go. And let's rotate this slightly. Then we want to make a copy of this by pressing Control or Command J. And actually, in fact, we're going to use the bottom one to raise this up a little bit so it's in the back. So let's raise this up after we've flipped this horizontally. So somewhere right about here. And that looks nice. Let's go ahead and highlight both of these. Press Command G. That way we can group these together. But now we need to start working with the lighting levels on that brick. So what we want to do is add an exposure adjustment layer, clip it to those bricks, and let's just lower the lighting on this. And the end is going to look a little funny, so what we have to do now is just touch up this endpoint here. So let's zoom in and then just patch this up a little bit since we have some of that background layer peeking through. Alright, that's looking really nice there. And what we need to do, because this is going to look a little funny right here with that shadow, so I'm going back to my trees, press Command J, so that way we can create another copy, and we're going to bring this up to the top here. So let's raise this up, and we're going to scale this down, just kind of put it so it fits over that shadow. Alright, so somewhere right around here, let's move that to the bottom of our tree so it's in the back. And we want to add a layer mask, invert that by pressing Command I, and then using a hard round brush tip at 100% opacity, let's paint this back in. We don't need the whole tree, so just this top right portion. And in fact, we're going to have to switch to one of my tree texture brushes because we need to just match the textures of that tree so it looks more like a tree and not just a hard round brush tip from Photoshop. So let's touch this area up right here. Alright, I think the edges are looking really good on this. We're going to transition back to those bricks by adding an exposure adjustment layer. We're going to create some shadows here. So let's invert that mask, switch back to a normal brush, and then just at the top here, we'll give a little bit of shadow at the bottom, as well as right behind these trees a little bit. We are going to have some light kind of wrapping around the side there, so we don't want to do too much shadow work on the right side of that. So right around here is good. And then we can just add a little bit of shadow just on the edge here, just so it kind of looks like it's a little bit more curved. And we might have to go back into our levels below and paint some of that back in too. Yeah, there we go. Alright, so let's transition to the trees. We're going to do the same thing using the exposure adjustment layer. And then what we want to do, because we are going to have some light reflected from the moon. So just at the top here, we want to bring some of that lighter color back in. So something like this. And then we can go to our trees in the back and touch that up a little bit as well on that exposure adjustment layer. Just paint some of that light back in. Okay, very good. Let's go back to the trees that we were just working on. And we're going to put a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top. Clip it below. Go ahead and hit that colorize box. And then we're just going to find the right hue and the right saturation that is going to look a bit realistic for our picture here. So somewhere in the greens, but we don't want it so saturated. So we'll kind of keep this down here a little bit. And we might warm it up just a little bit. Okay, good. And then in the background, what we're going to do here is add a new layer. And we're just going to paint a little bit more glow and a little bit more light that's just peeking through. This is the same yellow color that we worked on before. And on the edge here, we'll just wrap that light around, peeking through these little corners just a little bit. And then we'll do the same thing off to the corners on the right side here by the bridge too. Alright, so this is looking really nice. I like the a little bit more effective glow on here. And we can check out the before and after on that. So it's a nice little addition. I want to go back to our levels adjustment for that background layer because I just want to go ahead and add a little bit more shadows on some of these trees and buildings a little bit. So I'm going to take a few seconds here just to add that and clean that up just a little bit more. Alright, and now that we've got that settled, let's go and add a color balance adjustment layer to that background layer on top of the levels. And we're going to warm this up a little bit. We're only paying attention to just those trees. because what we're going to do here is invert that mask by pressing Command I once we kind of get this settled here. Alright, so let's hit Command I, and we just want to paint white just on the tips of these trees here, just to add a little bit more of a highlight. And then we're going to make that a little bit more pronounced by adding a brand new layer on top of that, and using that yellow color at a higher opacity, just hitting the tops of those trees as a little bit of a rim light. But we need to use the blend if to help blend that in a little bit better, so it just doesn't look like a yellow line across the top. So let's go ahead and double click on that layer. And then at the bottom here, let's Alt or Option click on that anchor, divide it up, and bring some of those shadows back in. In fact, let's go ahead and take this glow one step further. We're going to add a new layer beneath that background layer, and using that yellow, just give it a bit more glow right here at the tips of the trees there. So it looks like more light is just kind of bouncing back and reflecting off the backside of that tree. Alright, good. So we can go ahead and add a bit more shadow to some of this area, and we're going to do that by adding another exposure adjustment layer right below that levels. And then we're going to decrease this quite a bit, and we can bring back our main subject as well, just to kind of help us out a little bit for reference. And then just kind of at the bottoms of some of these houses and buildings here, we just want to create a bit of a shadow. So, you know, as you're doing this, and the more layers you add, the more parts are going to have highlights, the more parts are going to have shadows. So make sure that you're taking your time with this realistically and getting everything accurate as possible. So what I'm going to do here is just take a few more seconds with this, kind of speed through this a little bit here, and I'll be back with you in just a second once I've finished adding these on. Alright, so I think this will do it for the shadows, and I'm like where we're at here. I want to add a bit more color, and we're going to add another color balance on top of this. Try to add a little bit more blues maybe in some of these shadow areas, and just kind of tweak it just a little bit. And we can go ahead and just reduce the opacity just a smidge on here as well. And now our background is looking really good. I feel like we're at the time now where we need to start painting in some of those cables on the bridge. So add a new layer on the top. We're just going to go ahead and paint some of these lines in. If you just click, hold down the shift key, click at the bottom, we'll get these straight lines. So I'm just kind of finding those little, I don't know what they are, little anchors or something up there, and that's where I'm just connecting these lines. And what I'm going to have to do is pull a ruler off to the side. If you don't have your ruler guide set up, just hit Command R, and then if you just make sure that your move tool is selected, and then either at the very top at the ruler or at the left side, you can just go ahead and click and drag in a guide. But you get the general gist of what we're doing here. Let's go ahead and just transition over to with all of those painted in already, so we're not wasting more time with this video. And this is what that looks like. And I know we've already added a lot of glow to that sunset, but I think I want to brighten it up just a little bit more. So let's add a solid color adjustment layer. Find a nice yellowish tone to work with, and then we're going to actually put this into a linear dodge blend mode. And then once we have that, invert the mask by pressing Ctrl or Command I, and then just on the side here, painting some of that back in just to make it exaggerated even more so than what we had it originally. And honestly, this is just me being a bit more nitpicky, and I just wanted to show you my process here. And so let's go ahead and we can change that color up just a little bit as well. Alright, now what I want to do is add a colored balance adjustment layer to have a different color for some of those shadow tones. So we're just going to add a little bit more blues, maybe a little bit of the teal and magenta, and that should be right what we're looking for. And to make sure that we're really only targeting that shadow area, we've inverted the mask, and we're just going to paint back some of those areas where it's not really directly being hit with that sunlight from the sunset there. And I've actually switched back to my exposure adjustment layer to just touch up some of those shadows. I'm going to speed through this section here. I'll be back with you in just a second once I've added those adjustments on there as well. Alright, very good. Let's go ahead and add some haze at the top of the building on the right side there. We're going to add a new layer. And then if you hold down I for your eyedropper, we'll sample one of those colors up top and then slightly paint some of that just at the top of the building there to, again, it just kind of helps a little bit with the atmospheric depth. And then on a new layer on top, we're going to add some highlights. So let's switch up the color here. And then just on the edge at the very top there and all along parts of the building, we're going to paint a little bit of highlight on there from that sunset in the back. So for the most part, our background is right where we want it to be. Now we're going to take everything that we've just applied to that background in terms of lighting and color grading, and we're going to apply that to the rest of our buildings in our foreground. And since I just showed you all of that to our background, I'm not going to walk you step by step for the rest of these buildings here. Let's skip over that and we can just continue on and work with our subject. Okay, let's go ahead and get to work on our main guy here. Now, the basic principles are going to apply like everything else. We're going to start out with the lighting levels, and we're starting out with an exposure adjustment layer to turn this down. And right around here is going to look good. Instead of inverting the mask, we're just going to go ahead and paint black on that layer mask, primarily on the front of his face, because that's really where that light from the moonlight is going to hit the majority of his body, just kind of on the face here. So we're going to paint black on there. And because he is our main subject, I'm really trying to just be as accurate as possible. Not that I wasn't doing that with the rest of our images, but he is going to be the first thing that we look at, so I want to make sure I take my time to do this right here. And I think we have a good lighting levels adjustment here and foundation to build off of. We're going to add another exposure adjustment layer to act as our primary shadow layer. So let's turn this down, and right around here is going to be good. Let's invert that mask by pressing Command I, and just on the back side, let's bring those shadows back in. Okay, and then once we got this all sorted out, we're going to go ahead and add a color balance adjustment layer on top of this. You know, we're just repeating those same steps. It starts becoming muscle memory after a while. You get your lighting levels first, and then you start working with your color grading, which is what we're doing right now, and then you can start to finesse it just a bit more to make it look really clean. So we're going to add another shadows layer on here, but for this we're going to put this into multiply blend mode. I've already sampled a bit of the color on his skin here, and we're just going to paint some of this back in manually to help with the shadows. Sometimes the exposure adjustment layer doesn't do as well of a job that you want it to, and we need to add a bit more different tones to these shadows. So for me, this is actually the hardest part of the composition itself. The skin can be really tricky to work with, especially when you're working with original images that came from a daytime setting or a nighttime setting, and now you're putting it in the reverse. So the skin tones are going to be a little bit different, and as you can see here, I'm just sampling different tones on the skin to try to keep it very consistent with the skin tones that he originally has. And then we just want to make sure that we're painting the right colors in the right areas. Obviously the darker tones for the shadow areas, and the areas that are going to be, you know, have more highlight to them, you change the color to something a little bit more white in tone. So I'm going to go over this for a little bit more and touch the skin up here. There's a lot to do here, so I'm actually going to go ahead and speed through this section so you can at least see my workflow for this. I'll be back with you all in just a second here. Alright, so I'm happy with this, how it looks for right now. I'll probably touch up on this a little bit later on, but for right now we can continue on. And let's go ahead and start working with the moon. I'm actually gonna get rid of the original moon and add a new one. This is a 3D element from Envato Elements. I like it a little bit better since it doesn't have all of those dark spots on it. And for the face, I found this picture here, and let's go ahead and turn this one on. And this is at the right angle, and I really like the look of it, so I'm gonna use the pen tool just to create a selection of this guy's face here. And then we're gonna go ahead and create a selection of that and add a layer mask so we just have it by itself away from everything else. And then what I want to do is Control-Command-T and scale this up after we went ahead and turned down the opacity. And we're going to try to align it as best as possible to the right side of the moon. So it actually took a few seconds to do this because it was a little tricky just to find that right angle. And like I said before, I'm a perfectionist, so I probably spent more time on this than I probably should. But I want to make sure that it's at that right spot, you know, just to make sure it looks good. Alright, so I ultimately settled for this angle here, turned up the opacity again, and we're going to make a copy of that by pressing Command-J and turn that into a smart object. This way we have one as a backup and we can do a lot of edits with this new one here. So let's bring this to the bottom. And at the top we'll add a layer mask on there, and we're going to paint at the neck area first just to kind of get rid of it. In fact, let's switch this up to a hard round brush at 100% opacity, and let's clean this up a little bit. We really don't need a lot of this, just kind of the front of the face. So we can even get rid of some of the back of the head here. And let's clean this up. Okay. And then let's go back to our moon, add a layer mask on that so that way we can erase the right side of this here. And then we can go back to the head again and just kind of touch up that top right portion. Alright, so let's erase that by pressing Command-Z and undo. And we're going to convert this to a smart object again, and that way we can warp this. And just at that top right corner, we're just going to kind of wrap it around so it lines up perfectly with the rest of the moon. So that looks really nice. Let's go back and add another layer mask on here. And in the moon, we can touch up that spot right by the forehead. Okay, perfect. So back onto our original guy, and we can just clean up that area again. But we're ultimately going to switch back to a soft round brush so we can have a gradual transition to that moon. So that's what we're doing right now. We really just want to preserve the front of the face. And I think this will do it. This at least gives us a good foundation to work off of. Let's next go ahead and match the color of the moon. So we're going to desaturate this by using a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And now that we've added that, we have to apply those same textures on the face that we have with the moon, because right now it looks really off, and that's what's happening here. So let's go ahead and click on that moon layer and then press Control or Command-J to make a copy of that. Let's drag the layer mask down to the bin there, move this out to the top, and then we're going to just drag that back half of the moon to cover the majority of the face, because that has the texture that I want to use. So somewhere right here, and then we can go ahead and add a layer mask on top of this, invert it, and then using a soft round brush, just go ahead and paint back some of that texture in on different parts of the face here. So we're going to be working with a lot of the flatter surfaces, like the forehead, the cheeks, some of the nose area. And we're going to take a few seconds here just to apply that. So I'm going to speed through this section, and I'll be back with you in just a second once it's complete. Alright, perfect. So the textures look really good, and that's going to help make the image a lot more believable that it's actually, the face is coming from the moon. Let's go ahead and start with the lighting on here. We're going to add an exposure adjustment layer on top of this once we've grouped everything together. And let's go ahead and Alt or Option click on that to clip it there, and let's turn up the exposure. We're going to invert that mask, and then using a soft round brush, we're just going to paint some of that back in on the back side of the moon there, just to make that more bright. And then even some of the parts like on the cheek and forehead, things like that. If you kind of think about the contour of the face and all those protruding parts of the facial structure, that's kind of the area that I'm giving the highlights to. So So we've added that. We're adding another layer on top, and this is just going to be kind of an overall glow that we're just going to add on there just to kind of soften up a little bit. We'll do a couple of dabs here. And next I can go ahead and add a new layer underneath our moon group, and we're going to start adding a little bit of glow around that rim, and that'll start that process. So we're at 100% opacity using a soft round brush, and just along the edge, starting to give it a little bit of that rim light. And this is what's going to help create that glowing effect, at least initiate the process. Okay, so in terms of rim light and glow, this is looking really nice. I want to go back into our moon group and I want to add a levels adjustment layer because I want to go ahead and do a little bit of tweaking with that. So I'm just going to take a couple of seconds in here to make some adjustments. And this looks good. So let's go ahead and we can close this up. I'm going to add a new layer on top because we're just going to continue to exaggerate a lot of those highlights and the glows. So let's go back into our face here. And as I mentioned before, I want to exaggerate a lot of the areas that are kind of protruding out a little bit on the facial structure. So I'm going over those areas and just making those pop just a little bit more than what I originally had. And what I'm actually going to do here is take the next couple of minutes to just make some minor adjustments on the moon and the face in terms of highlights and shadows and even some of that glow work. And I'm not going to talk over that because it's a bit redundant, so I'll just let you watch the process. I think it speaks for itself of kind of my workflow here. So I'll be back with you in just a minute once I finish making these adjustments. And that's going to do it for our moon. I think he looks really good. We can go ahead and transition to our buildings in the middle here. And we're going to start with the windows because we want to start adding some lights. So I'm switching to a polygonal lasso tool. And what we want to do is just create a selection of all of these different windows on this building. And then we want to find a nice yellow color to start out as our base color. And so this will do, we'll fill that selection in with that yellow. We'll do another one here. And same thing, once we've connected that, just fill that with yellow. But we're gonna do these one by one, all these individual windows, and we're just gonna fill that with the same color. We're gonna work with multiple colors. This is just our foundation and the base color. So we're gonna add a solid color adjustment layer now. And let's find more of an orange tint that we're gonna use. So something like this, and we can play around with our blend modes. So either color dodge or linear dodge. I think we'll stick with the linear dodge, and then we're going to invert that mask, and this is going to help with the glow just kind of around the edges there. So we'll give it a few dabs to just start the glowing process of the windows here. Okay, this is looking good. Let's add another color on top of this. We'll go back to a solid color adjustment layer, just switch up the colors a little bit. And for this, we can put into one of our blend modes. We'll just kind of see what looks good. So maybe we'll stick with this linear burn, and we can switch up the colors. We want to add different variety of hues because that's what's going to give our windows some dimension and some depth. So you can see here, we're just going around the edges, just adding a little bit of, again, dimension to our space. And I'm kind of rushing through this. If you're doing this, you obviously want to take your time with this, but just for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just kind of showing you the technique of what I use to do this. So we'll do this one color here, and then we can find another one, and we can make this one our brightest point. So something a very bright yellow like this. We'll invert the mask here by pressing Control Command I. There we go. And then at the center of the windows is where we just kind of want to paint this back in. And you know, anytime that you're working with light sources, you have varying degrees of light intensity. And that's all that I'm doing here with the windows. But like I said, this helps give it some dimension instead of just using one solid color and then painting a glow on top. But on this new layer, this is what we are going to use as kind of like our overall glow from these windows. So we'll just do a couple of dabs on each of these windows, and that should pretty much do it. So at this point, our composition looks great. We are just winding down and doing the final touches of what we need to do here. And we're going to start out with just adding a little bit of highlight work on this, any interacting object that we have close to these windows. So we're going to start with this front building and adding a little bit of highlights onto the different parts of this building. But essentially what I'm doing right now is just making those final touches from the glow, not only from the light on here, but a little bit of the interacting light from our moon. So we're going to touch up some spots there. I don't think I needed to walk you through all of this just to add on there. Just showing you kind of before I send this to the camera raw filter, I like to do some final touch-ups, and that's what we're doing right now. So I'm going to take a couple more seconds just to add these on here, and then we'll be good to go to merge these together and send it to the camera raw filter. Alright, perfect, we're good to go. We have a new layer at the top, and then if you press Command Shift Option E or Control Shift Alt E, will merge all these together at the top, convert it to a smart object. Then at the very top, we want to go to Filter, and then down to Camera Raw Filter, and then we'll do some final modifications in here, and we'll call it a day. So just to talk you through what I usually like to do in here, I start out with some basic stuff like any exposure or contrast adjustments. I may make it a bit more saturated. I like to add some sharpening on here as well, and then do some work in the color mixer. Anytime I want to play with colors, make them more saturated or lighter, I'll do that. Fill it up with some final effects like grain, and then we can go into the color grade where we're at right now and do some last minute overall color adjustments. And that's pretty much what I like to do in the camera raw filter. So I'll hit OK on this, and then this is going to be our final picture for this tutorial. It was a bit of a long one, and well, hopefully I still have people listening to the video here. Thanks a lot for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to give it a like. If you like these kinds of tutorials as well, just let me know down there in the comment section. If you'd like to see other things from me, also leave me some notice down there as well. I like to hear the feedback from you all, and I really appreciate everything that you guys give me. Anyways, the video's gone on long enough, and well, we're just gonna go ahead and call it a wrap. Please come back next week for our next video. Until then, please be safe and take care, guys.